Like the video, subscribe to the channel and press the bell icon for latest video updates.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Examining Life. Today I'm with my professor, Professor Volkman. He was one of my professors here at Southern Connecticut State University. And would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Professor Richard Volkman at the Department of Philosophy at Southern Connecticut State University. And I've been here, 20 years now. I had a lot of great students, including Amanda. And I'm always happy to talk to anybody about philosophy, and so I'm grateful for this opportunity.
Thank you. So today's question that we're going to focus on is self-reliance the virtue needed to cure what ails us? So what inspired you to look into this question, and what's your research about?
Yeah, so what ails us, I guess, is what we're asking here, is the extreme partisanship and extreme tribalism that seems to have accompanied the growth of the information age, and especially social media.
Yeah.
And the shouting and the very angry vitriol that we see all around us is really causing a considerable, I don't know if we could call it a crisis yet, but it's certainly looking that way. It's looking very scary, and it seems to me that we've lost track of some of the virtues that might have kept us on a better path in the past. And in particular, Ralph Waldo Emerson, I think, had a much more, let's say, magnanimous way of understanding the fundamental facts of human difference. And I think that's where we have to be. I think people have to get back to a place where they realize that we're not all the same, that we have very different cultural and biological inheritances that cause us to be very different people, that we can look at the exact same thing and see something very different. And for Emerson, this is a sign that there's more to know in the world than any one perspective could give you. And that it sounds a little crazy to put it this way, but it's the way Emerson would put it. It is divine providence, therefore, that we should be different, so that we can have an open conversation and make sure that everything that is has an opportunity to be known. And I think we've lost track of that for a whole bunch of reasons, not least of which because people don't read Emerson the way they should. But I think it goes deeper than that, because the tribalism is very deep. It's got biological, as I said, and cultural origins that themselves impel us to fail to have self-reliance. So I think the next thing to try to say is something about what self-reliance is. Then why would that be the thing that could help us here? And to get at that, I think we need to first head off two very common errors about what self-reliance is. The first is that people sometimes have this sense that Emerson is telling us that we should all, go off and live in the woods like a hermit or something. And that couldn't be further from the truth. That isn't even what Henry David Thoreau, his close friend, did. He did that little experiment going out to Walden, but that wasn't his life, and that wasn't, that was more because he didn't want to get a real job than it was because he was trying to be a hermit, right? He would go into Concord almost, just routinely, even during the time while he was living out in the woods. So that's the first thing. It's not antisocial. It's not trying to get away from society. It's not trying to escape society. In Self-Reliance, Emerson explicitly says just the opposite. He tells us that great human beings are going to want to be in the midst of the hustle and bustle of society. But he does say that the great person is going to be someone who can, as he says, carry his solitude with him amidst the crowd. And what I take him to mean by that then relates to the second error that I often see. Because the whole point of self-reliance, the opposite of self-reliance, is conformity. So the whole point of self-reliance is to be a non-conformist, and he makes that very explicit, right? And people often read that, and they assume that it means somehow being different for the sake of being different. But that's a failure of self-reliance. And it's really important to understand why that is. If you're being different for the sake of being different, just to sort of stand out from the crowd, you're presumably doing that because you care about what other people think about you. And you're actually trying to cultivate a certain kind of reputation for being avant-garde or bohemian or whatever.
Yeah.
And if you're doing it with that motive, that's as much a failure of self-reliance as if you were doing it for the sake of, or doing anything for the sake of simply pleasing others, right?
Okay, right.
That's as much a failure of self-reliance as anything. And so conformity of the sort that Emerson is objecting to is the kind where you imagine that you have to be just like everybody else in order to fit in, no matter how you feel yourself, no matter what your honest opinion is. So fundamentally, conformity is a dishonesty always. It's a failure of integrity. And there's a very big difference between being similar
Yeah.
and conforming.
Right.
So, if I'm here and then next week you're in Greece,
Yeah.
and we both happen to look up at the sky at the same time,
Right.
and we both see the same star and we both regard it as beautiful,
Right.
we're doing something that's the same, but we're not conforming to one another. We're not doing it, obviously, we're thousands of miles apart.
Yeah.
We're not doing it from a base conformist instinct.
Yeah.
And that could be true even if you were here and we were looking at that same
Yeah.
star together. And it could even be true if I hadn't noticed the star and you turn to me knowing that I'm the kind of person who finds beautiful stars worth looking at,
Yeah.
and you say, look at that. I'm still not merely acting out of conformity to you.
Okay.
The objectionable kind of conformity that is a failure of self-reliance is what we encounter when I would lie and say, of course it's beautiful. And I'm saying that not because it's beautiful, not because I think it's beautiful, but because I'm trying to impress you.
Okay.
That would be a failure of self-reliance, where I'm not being fully honest.
Yeah.
Now, maybe if I don't think it's beautiful, maybe I should just keep my mouth shut, or just say, well, I've seen better. I don't have to be a jerk about it, right?
Right,
That's not
yeah,
the point
no,
of
that makes
self-reliance, right? The point is that supposing that we have anything in common, and we are going to have lots of things in common, because although humans are each unique individuals, we are humans.
Something bonds. Yeah, or binds people.
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
with
There's a
different
there's
forms.
a similar kind of nature, and so we should expect that people are going to be fairly similar, even in the absence of any conformity. So, what is the point of self-reliance then? Well, once we take away these two very common errors about self-reliance, what we're left with is the idea that you really ought to think for yourself, and you really ought to be honest with yourself about what you really think. And it's important that you share that with others, because they may not have thought of it themselves. And so this gives you an opportunity to actually increase the knowledge and wisdom, ultimately, of everybody that you have a chance to be in contact with.
Yeah.
If you conform,
Yeah.
then you're actually denying the world your unique insight, your irreplaceable perspective that nobody else can give.
Yeah.
And so it's a kind of crime for Emerson. It's a crime against the divine. And, I don't know if I would wholly endorse that. I'm kind of on the fence about what to think about the language of divinity.
Okay.
But I think at a minimum it's a really good metaphor to get us to think about what is highest and most
Yeah.
important. And if we just think about it in that frame, without any of the religious baggage, I think it's a really powerful idea, and I find it at least very compelling.
Yeah. Like, not everyone can be a non-conformist, right?
I don't think that's
So-
true in the sense that
okay.
I just said,
Okay.
right? So, and that is a common objection that people raise against Emerson. I meant to fold it into the earlier discussion, actually, when I was trying to point out what conformity is and what conformity is not.
Yeah.
So the fact is that we could all be exactly the same. We're not. But we could
Right.
all be exactly the same, and no one of us be a conformist. So it's not true
Okay.
that we can't all be nonconformists, because we must not conflate conformity
Yeah.
for being similar.
Okay.
Just because we're alike, that's
Right.
that's something to cherish and celebrate, presumably. Just because we're alike doesn't mean that we have to be basing our views and our thoughts
Yeah.
on what the herd around us thinks.
Right.
We can all be thinking for ourselves, and
Right.
all be attracted to the exact same truths.
The people in that herd who are like the majority in any given society or community who are kind of dictating what people think, how do all of those individuals also non-conform when they're...
Well, I wish they wouldn't do that. I wish they would be self-reliant, right? And that is why I think self-reliance is the virtue that we need right now. I don't think that we're likely to get it because this requires, some 7 billion of us to all sort of realize that this is the way to be.
Right.
I don't have any sort of political mechanism whereby I could force everybody to be self-reliant. You can see the contradiction inherent in the very notion, right? Which means that all I can do is tell people, your life will go better insofar as you are self-reliant, insofar as you think for yourself, and make a gift of yourself unto the world by letting us know what you really think. And if you fail at that, everyone's the more impoverished. Now, I don't know if that's going to find an audience of everybody. I'm guessing it won't, because the biological and cultural forces that make us conform are incredibly strong. And I think that's what you're getting at beneath the surface of what you were asking about. These are incredibly strong emotions, and the fact that you would feel the tug of conformity is not itself a failure of self-reliance.
Okay.
The fact that you would feel like you'd better get along or they're going to threaten you with something is not a failure of self-reliance.
Okay.
A failure of self-reliance is when you take that to heart and you start to believe lies or you start to speak lies. Now, that means that the self-reliant individual is going to be able to avoid especially the worst kinds of tribalism that we see online, where when somebody presents an idea, the first thought that so many people have today in this age of social media is not, is it true? How would I know if it's true?
Right.
But which tribe said this?
Right.
And if it was said by the other tribe, then my job is to declare that this is wicked. That's not an argument. That's just an assertion and an attempt at shaming. It's an attempt at actually demolishing somebody else's self-reliance, trying to get them to believe your way by brute force instead of force of argument.
So from like a tribalism perspective or like a community perspective, if like aspects of one's identity is strongly tied to that herd or group mentality, how does that individual become self-reliant? Or like how would you suggest that individual to become self-reliant because their identity is so existentially connected?
Yeah, and again, this is typical. This is what actual socialization is all about. It looks like it was probably adaptive in our evolutionary history. So there's going to be a very strong tendency to do that.
Right.
I would submit that if you actually want to do what's best for your tribe, then be yourself.
Okay.
That's what's best for your tribe. That's what's best for those who are not in your tribe. That's what's best for you. To be yourself, think for yourself, become who you are.
So does that mean like the whole tribe's identity would change if...
Again, we may very well be incredibly similar.
Yeah.
And it's an empirical question, how similar we are. We may be very similar in a way that makes us all appear like we're actually conforming when we're actually all looking at a star.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
And so for that reason, there's no reason to think that self-reliance rules out sociability.
Okay.
To the contrary,
Emerson
explicitly says, the great man is him who can carry his solitude with him amidst the crowd. That's the ideal. And that's what I would contend we should aspire to be more like. I also expect fully that we will dismally fail. We are incredibly social animals, ultra-social animals. And we have huge chunks of our biological and cultural inheritances that are pushing us all the time. The reason to champion self-reliance is not because that's somehow the natural state of humanity, just the opposite. So what's giving you some cause for concern here is that you're saying, wait a minute, that's really hard. I don't know if we can do that. To which I would say, yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
The reason we have to remind ourselves to be self-reliant is because we are always tempted to conform instead.
Okay.
And so self-reliance is an accomplishment.
Okay.
It's not something that anybody ever gets easily.
Right.
And probably nobody realizes it perfectly. Like all the virtues, we aspire to it. It's not necessarily something that, it wouldn't be a virtue if it was sort of a done deal.
Right.
It is not a done deal. It's an accomplishment.
Yeah. So there's a line in here that says, "What I must do is all that concerns me, not what people think." So, where does like selfishness come in here? Maybe
I guess
self-development, which isn't a bad thing, but creating your own identity and everything. But
yeah. So
if you're only thinking about yourself or concerned with yourself, then where does?
So this requires a very long conversation about the nature of selfishness. But there's a common conflation, and so let's add this as a third common confusion that one comes across when encountering Emerson. That there's a conflation between selfishness and self-interest.
Okay.
And these are not the same.
Yeah.
Right? So if I go after philosophy club tonight and I go home and I read a book just because I like to read a book, that's self-interested. But you'd have to be a really twisted moralist to say that that was selfish. Right?
Right. Yeah.
If I go home after philosophy club tonight and I read a book just because I like to read a book, when I promised my son I don't play a video game with him, that would be selfish.
Yeah.
And it would be selfish not because I'm doing something for myself instead of for my son. It would be selfish because I'm failing at one of my core projects, which is to be a good father.
Right. Okay.
And so being a good father is in my self-interest.
Yeah.
But it's not selfish.
Thank you very much for speaking to my audience about self-reliance and Emerson. Please like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments below what you think of self-reliance and what role it should play in society. Thank you.